Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be back for the third and final time. And today, the topic we're going to be talking about is a day in the life of a beekeeper because we have learned so much about honeybees and pollination already, but we don't quite know the responsibilities and role that the beekeeper plays. So, with that, I am going to share my screen. Let me pull up.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Three.
Is now the time for asking questions? Or didn't do that?
Um, do bees hibernate?
So bees do not hibernate, but they do slow their motions down up north when it's very cold. In the winter, the bees will stay inside the hive. They won't leave because honeybees don't like to leave the hive if it's less than about 50 degrees Fahrenheit out. They do not like the cold weather. And so the bees are going to stay in the hive, in the colony, during those winter months when it's cold out. And that's why it's so important that they have plenty of food, aka honey bee bread, inside of the hive before it gets cold. Because once it's cold, they're not able to leave. They don't hibernate like bears do, like they don't go into a sleep like state. They just slow down their motions and they don't really leave the hive.
Um,
That
also,
was a really good question.
do
Yes.
bees have the same number of stripes?
Yes, all the bees have the same number of stripes, although you might not be able to tell because the coloring of the bee can be darker or it can be lighter. So if it's a lighter color, then it's more noticeable, the stripe color, but they do all have the same number of stripes when talking about Apis mellifera or the European honeybee.
And
So, mhm.
how long do beekeepers work?
Well, that is a great question, and it really depends. Um, And I think you'll get a better idea once I get done with the presentation of all the responsibilities. And I'll kind of answer that during the presentation because it really just depends. So sorry, I'm having trouble sharing.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Those were really great questions. Um, okay. Share screen. There we go. I should know what I'm doing. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, here we go. So, a day in the life of a beekeeper, that is our topic today. Now, I have a quick activity for you all to do. Um, now, this is a frame of bees. Now, if I was to pull a frame, this is the beehive, right? This beekeeper is pulling out a frame. They have it pulled out, and now they have to look for the queen. So we've all had two previous lessons where we identified workers and drones and queen and the queen bee. So I'm going to test all of your beekeeping abilities, and I want you to see if you can find the queen. And if you find her, give her a big circle with your annotation device. Ah, yes. Awesome. Who was the first green circle?
Me.
Awesome job, Lexi. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that is the queen bee. Now, Lexi, how did you identify her? What were some of her key traits?
Well, I saw her because she didn't have as many. It didn't look like she had as many stripes, and also she had a shinier back.
Yes, that's actually I'm really happy you mentioned that point because her thorax, which is the middle part of her body, remember worker or honeybees have three body parts, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Her abdomen is a little bit more shinier you can think of. And that's when I'm looking at a frame of bees, not only do I realize that her abdomen is longer and more pointed, but also her thorax will be shinier because it's kind of bald when you compare it to the other workers. And then another really quick tip for trying to identify the queen bee very fast is all the workers. You see these workers around to her right, they're all pointed towards her because they are serving her. Yeah, that's their queen. They are being very attentive to her. So most of the worker bees around the queen will be facing towards her, ready to serve. So that's just another tip if you ever do find yourself in a beehive. So great job. Okay, so some of the objectives for this lesson is to identify the reasons for beekeeping, and then let me annotate. Is to identify the reasons for beekeeping, identify hive parts and the function of personal protective equipment, and then to recall what a beekeeper looks for during a hive inspection, and to recognize common colony diseases and pests. So we're going to do all 4 of those learning objectives during this very last presentation, and you are all going to be well on your way of becoming incredible beekeepers. So some reasons for beekeeping. There's really many. This is just a couple. And so one of the big ones, and this is for a lot of commercial beekeepers, is income, right? Beekeeping is a way that people can make money, and there is a huge need for honeybee pollination. We talked about all the crops, and a lot of those crops were some of your favorites, right? Um, Someone has to carry those bees. Someone has to take care of them when they're not pollinating. And so that is such a huge income generator for beekeepers. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm going to turn off the annotation feature really quick. I'm not super familiar with this. Okay, great. So the second thing, we briefly mentioned it, is pollination. You might want to get a beehive, you might want to start beekeeping because you have your own garden, you might have a small plot and you want to bring more pollination to those crops that you're growing so that you're able to produce more. That might be another reason. If you look at this photo right here, it's a beautiful jar of honey, and it looks like someone bottled it themselves and they did a really pretty fabric on top and they tied it with some twine. You might want to get into beekeeper because you want to produce your own honey. That's another great option. And that's actually one of the reasons why I got into beekeeping is I really enjoy doing a lot of hands-on crafts, and I thought it would be a really cool way that I could learn a new skill and produce honey. So that's what drew me to beekeeping initially. Another thing for people joining beekeeping, maybe this is more like hobbyist level, which means you don't have a lot of hives, maybe less than 10. You're not looking to beekeeping as a way of providing money. You just simply enjoy it for the reasons of taking part in saving honeybees. Maybe it brings you a deeper connection to the environment, or you're the type of individual who loves learning and you're always on that mission to learn new things, new ideas. Beekeeping is great to do that because you're constantly learning new things every day. Yep. Do you have a question, Lexi?
How do you like get the honey?
So I don't think I have a picture of a frame of honey, but on a frame of honey, it's all capped. And so what a beekeeper does is they'll take a knife and they will uncap the honey. This is once it's been removed from the hive. So there's no bees. They are processing honey in their home or their garage, or some people who have a lot of beehives, they have a honey processing facility. We actually have one at the University of Florida that anyone can use. So they will uncap the frame of honey. Then they're going to um, spin it. There's all different types of honey extractor machines, but basically it's a galvanized tin, and you place your frames of honey inside of it. And using centrifugal force, you're going to spin it either by electricity, or you can spin it like physically with your arm. And that's going to spin all of the honey out of the honeycomb into the bottom of the tin. Then you transfer it into buckets or bins, however big your operation is, and then you can filter out the honeycomb, like pieces of honeycomb. Sometimes there might be a dead bee that got inside. Sadly, sometimes that happens, unfortunately, but it doesn't happen that often. So that is just a really quick process. If you ever are interested in it, it's actually very cool. There's always people, if you look it up on YouTube, maybe get your parents or someone older than you to help you. And on YouTube, there will be like 30-minute long honey extraction videos, and it's very cool. Those are some of the videos that I started to learn very on, and
I
that's what caught my attention.
I
So check
I
it out on YouTube.
actually meant like how do you get them out of the hive without disturbing the bees?
So that is a good question. I'll actually talk about that when I start talking about the equipment.
Lauren,
So,
just so you know, in the chat, I put some pictures I have of myself uncapping honey with the knife and the
oh,
honey coming
nice.
out of the spinning device.
Oh, very cool. I'm having a hard time with my trackpad, my mouse on my computer. So I'm trying to share those in the chat. Let me see if I. Are you able to pull those up?
Yeah, give me just a second.
I'm so sorry. I'm having a hard time with my trackpad on my computer.
Yeah, let me share my screen really quickly. Okay, so lots of things on this screen, whoopsies. Okay, so sorry, these are on my personal Facebook page, so you'll see my stuff. This is from when I took the beekeeping course at the University of Florida, my senior year of undergraduate. And this, Lauren can talk about it more, but this is kind of the picture by picture process very quickly. Dr. Ellis here is using smoke thingy, don't know what's problem. That, yes. Um, do, 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 do. And we're just gonna clear all the drawings real quick. That's the smoke that helps calm down the bees. He pulled a frame out using a hive tool, which looks kind of like a teeny tiny crowbar. That's a blurry picture. There's more bees. I believe he just brushed them off. As you can see, he's been working with bees a long time. He doesn't wear the full suit that everyone else is wearing because bees like him. They don't like me. And he's holding up a queen and a worker bee, queen on the left, they're blurry. It was a terrible camera. I apologize. But this is honey that had come out of the spinning device, the centrifuge. This is the hot knife she's talking about to get the caps off of the honey. That's a better picture. That's my friend doing it. That's one of the lab techs doing it. And that's it coming out of the machine. So it's like a special electric knife that gets really hot and they slice the wax caps off.
It's so cool because that was at the old processing facility, and now we have the new bee lab. It's multi-million dollars. It's the biggest bee lab in the world, but we have a centrifuge honey extraction machine that's electric now that can hold up to 106 frames. So that just shows how much it's grown, because I have that exact same extractor and it only holds about 4 frames, but our new one is 106 frames of honey. So quite a large operation.
All right.
But yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really neat. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
No, I can't.
Okay, let me
I don't see anything.
Let me go back to screen sharing again. Okay. Now can you see it?
Nope.
What in the world?
I still can't see anything. I can't see anything.
Okay, let me make sure. Okay, here we go. Thumbs up if we're good. Can you see it? Great. Okay, so I'm gonna go through this section pretty quickly because I think you'll enjoy the end of this. So here's the hive components. You just saw a couple pictures of them, but basically the boxes are an essential part. There's 3 different size boxes you can see. They're colored green, yellow, and red. The green box is what we call the brood box. That's where the queen stays, the brood is raised, and there is some honey. Then above the brood box is what beekeepers will place a shallow super. So we call it a honey super. And that is what will be used whenever you're trying to make honey. Now, that's not always kept on the hive, it's only during honey flows or nectar flows. Another important part is the bottom board. We place a bottom board on the hive, and typically in Florida, it's a screened bottom board, so that way bees can drop out trash and different pests can fall out of the screened bottom board. Up north, however, they have a totally enclosed bottom board, and it's just a piece of wood, and that's because it's so cold that they need the extra warmth. Then we have our frames and foundations. So honeybee hives either come in 10 frames or 8 frames. It's really the beekeeper's preference, but each box would have 8 frames or 10 frames. Then on top, we have our hive cover, and it's the beekeeper's choice. They can have an inner cover or they can just have an outer cover. Most commercial beekeepers stick to an outer cover with a hole drilled on the top so they can place sugar water whenever they're transporting their bees to different crops. And then the very last thing, which is optional, is a hive stand. A lot of commercial beekeepers will place them on pallets. I place my hive not on a hive stand. I just have 2 posts that are held up by concrete blocks. And that way it's high enough off the ground so that skunks won't come and try to steal the honey. And that's the logic behind it. So you want it up high enough off the ground that ants can't intrude, skunks can't come in. And yeah, so again, the form of hive stand is optional. And then another optional feature is the queen excluder. I personally use a queen excluder in my hive, but it goes between the brood box and the honey super. And the queen excluder, like it sounds, it's going to keep the queen from going in between the 2 boxes because we want to keep the queen in the brood box so she lays brood only in those frames, because in our honey super we just want 100% honey. We don't want any brood because then that makes it hard when we're processing the honey like we just saw. Okay, the boxes. We kind of briefly talked about this, so unless there's any questions, I'm going to click through to the next. Okay, so the nook. Now this sounds a bit different. We haven't talked about this yet. This is actually a 5-frame tiny hive. Just think of it as a half hive. And so the nook is what we use to accommodate a new hive. This is very small hive. The queen has just started to grow this hive. It has a new queen, a new colony, and it needs to be half of the size of a normal colony because it doesn't have as many workers to defend it. And if you have a larger hive, there's a greater chance that, you know, pests will come in and it becomes harder to defend and to keep warm and to regulate. So that's the idea of the nook. And really quick, if you were to buy a colony of bees, this is what it would come in. This box is 5 frames with the queen who's already mated, and typically 4 frames of drawn out brood and 1 frame of honey. And then the bottom board, I mentioned, but this is a great photo of the different bottom board styles. The top is completely wooden, and that's what they use up north because that's going to keep more heat inside. And then the bottom is screened. And this is important for Florida because it does get very hot. So it's nice to have some thermoregulation, some cool air to be able to filter in and out of the hive. But also, it makes it possible for honeybees to drop off mites, and the mites would fall through the cracks and then out of the hive. Or when they're cleaning, it allows that trash to flow out of the hive. Now, we've looked at the box, but inside of the box, how many frames can there potentially be? I said 2 numbers. Can anyone remember?
8 or 10.
Awesome job. Yeah. So 8 or 10.
And you begin with 5.
Yep. Oh, great. Yeah, you do begin with 5. So there's different size of the frames, but typically, they have the same shape, but I'll explain some of the optional features. So a beekeeper can either purchase the frames already built or they can glue them and staple them together themselves. I am not good with building things, so I prefer to just buy the frames already built for me. Now, it is optional as to whether or not you want the foundation. This yellow piece, it has honeycomb, the shapes already drawn out, and this is made of plastic. But if you are wanting to produce honeycomb as a beekeeper, you would choose foundationless frames. The perks of having a frame with foundation is it encourages the honeybees, a new colony, to build a lot of comb because it stimulates them to build. Now, some of the important tools that we have as beekeepers that we always have on us, this is the number one essential tool, and it's the hive tool. It is the most important and most used piece of beekeeping equipment. Some beekeepers, they don't have to use a smoker, they don't have to wear a suit, although I highly recommend it, but they have to have a hive tool. So there's different kinds. The hive tool that I prefer is the top hive tool, and this is just a standard hive tool. The bottom hive tool is a J hook. My best friend who's a beekeeper prefers the J hook, but it just doesn't suit my hand motion. So that's totally up to the beekeeper. Um, and it's really important whenever you are working different colonies. So say you work your first colony and then you move to your second colony, it's important that you wash off your hive tool, because as you're scraping and lifting lids and pulling out frames, it's going to accumulate propolis and pollen and honey and all those different hive building materials, and you don't want to carry that between hives. You can think of it as, a doctor is going to change their gloves and, sanitize their hands between seeing patients. This is kind of the same idea. We can think of the hive tool as a doctor's glove. So we're going to be not changing it out, but we're going to be cleaning it between hives so we're not carrying over diseases. Now, the second essential tool is a smoker. And so you can see the smoker to the right here. It's galvanized, there's different styles, but the idea behind the smoker is that inside this stainless steel chamber here, you can pop open the lid and light a very small fire. The best means for keeping this fire, you don't want there to be a lot of flames, right? You want it to produce a lot of smoke. So we have a very small fire, and we have this pump to the left is what we'll use to pump a little bit of oxygen inside to keep that fire going. What I prefer to use to get the fire going in a hive, inside the smoker, is pine straw needles. It turns out Florida has a lot of natural and native pine trees, so it's a really great means to start a fire inside your smoker, and it prolongs the smoker. So we've talked about the hive tools, but it is important to talk about what healthy bees should look like. And you should already have a really good idea, but I'm just going to refresh our memory. So to the left here, we have our queen. She is laying eggs. She has her worker bees attending her, and she looks pretty healthy. You might wonder what this green dot is on her back, but that's actually a pin that the beekeeper will mark their queen with. They're very gentle when they mark the queen because she is so important. And they have a pin and they put a small dot on her back. And very large beekeeping operations will have a different color dot on the back of their queens, which lets them know the year that they were purchased. So, for example, the queen that was inside of the hive, not in this hive, but another hive next to it, she might have a red dot on her back, simulating that she's 1 to 2 years old. This queen, the green dot, can mean that she's 3 to 4 years old. The beekeeper can decide for themselves what it means, but it is a sign for them of the age of the queen so that they're able to know and remember. The bees inside, the inside is the drone, and you'll see a worker bee to the top, but where my trackpad is the drone. Now, how do we tell the difference between a drone and a worker bee? Anyone wants to answer? Tilly?
They are much, much bigger, but
Yes.
smaller than the queen.
Mhm.
They have larger antennae and they have huge eyes. They're just
Right.
basically bigger is better.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think of them as having fly-like eyes. Flies have very big eyes, and I think of the same thing with the drone.
I actually thought of like not not having their butt pointy.
Yes, that too. I'm very glad that y'all remember this. Awesome. Ellen?
There's another part of why you can know it's a drone because they don't have any stinger. It's
Yeah.
also square.
Yeah, their bottom's more square shaped. So you and Lexi were definitely on track with that. And Tilly, awesome job. So that's the difference. And then the worker bee, this is a newly hatched worker bee. So she's a little bit fuzzy. I think she's cute. But she's going to lose some of that hair as she grows and develops. And that's totally normal. She's not losing her hair like we think of it as being bad to lose our hair, but this is actually good because that means her exoskeleton is hardening. So this is a little tip that I came up with, and it's what to look for when we're checking a hive. So we can think of 3 terms: mood, food, and brood. Say it with me: mood, brood, food. Actually, I said it
Mood,
backwards.
brood, and food. Mood,
Yes,
brood, food. Mood,
there we
brood.
go.
Okay.
Musical,
Piano song.
whatever it is. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, so let's dive into each one of these. Now, 3 words and 3 things that we're looking for when we go in a beehive, when we're looking inside of a hive. So, first is the mood. Whenever we approach the hive, so we're walking towards the hive, we're not even inside of it, we have not even used our hive tool to pop open the lid. We're going to be looking for the amount of bees, the foragers. So, are there worker bees that are leaving in and out of the hive? Also, can we look and see if those worker bees have pollen on their back legs in their pollen baskets? If they do, that's a really good indication that there's a lot of flowering plants in the area that the bees are using as food, or there's a honey flow that just started. So, those 2 things. Also, when we're approaching the hive, you can notice if you have several hives lined back to back to back, if bees are fighting with each other at the hive entrance, that's a really good idea that workers from one hive is robbing the other hive of honey and other hive products. So that's something to be on the lookout for. And if there is a robbing incident, beekeepers have different ways of addressing this, but it essentially comes from the fact that one hive is stronger than the hive beside it. So you may need to move the weaker hive, or you need to build up the amount of workers within the smaller hive so that they have a fighting chance. So those are a couple things to look for when we're walking up towards our hive. Okay, so now we have opened up the lid and we're inside the hive. Now we're going to be looking at their attitude. Are they in a bad mood? Are they buzzing? Are they coating the top of our bee suit? How are they acting? Now, there's a difference between being aggressive and defensive. If the bees are defensive, we may just puff a little bit more smoke, and that calms the bees down because they're not able to exchange the attack pheromones with each other, because the strong smell of the smoke overtakes the smell of the alarm pheromone. Which, fun fact, the alarm pheromone of a honeybee smells like a banana. So next time you smell a banana, that is what the alarm pheromone smells like, at least to me, whenever working a hive. Now, the second thing that we're going to be looking for is food. That's the amount of honey that's in the hive and pollen frames. So we want to make sure, the rule of thumb is for a 10 frame hive, we want to make sure that there is at least 3 frames of honey. And that's not even talking about pollen. So we want 3 full frames of honey. If there's any less than that, then you need to be doing some supplemental feeding, adding sugar water, or moving them to a new location. Another form of supplemental feeding that may occur is pollen patties. If you're looking at a frame and you notice towards the corners of the frame, there's not a lot of pollen being stored, or when you approach the hive and there's not pollen on the worker bees, that's a good indicator that you can add pollen patties. And this is just a credit card size amount of pollen that's actually manufactured, and it's a way to stimulate bees, and it provides food for them over the winter. However, you can apply too much of the pollen patties, and when this happens, it actually draws the attention of small hive beetles, which are not a good thing in a beehive, and I'll explain about that a little bit later. And then the final thing that we're looking for is we want to make sure that there's plenty of brood. Brood is the bees inside of the cells, the developing bees. And we want to make sure that there's plenty of those, because that's the future of the hive. That is what will be emerging in 3 weeks. And we want to make sure that there's a steady population that's growing. Certain times of the year, you may find it decreasing during the winter, and that's okay. But during the spring and the summer, we want to see great brood buildup. So what we're looking for is a good brood pattern, and that comes from the queen, how she lays eggs within a frame. If she's laying eggs very evenly across the frame, meaning that there's not a lot of spotty honeycomb cells that haven't been filled, that's good. That's a sign of a good queen. But when you are looking at a frame of bees, of brood more specifically, and you notice that there's a lot of empty cells, your queen's probably aging, or she's not of a very good quality, and that's a good indication that you may need to replace her. Okay, so moving right along, we're going to be talking now about what the larva is going to look like. So we talked about the healthy bees, the adult bees, but we need to get a refresher on what healthy larva looks like, because I haven't went into this topic in depth. So you'll notice on this image of the right, it's actually a cross-cut section of a piece of honeycomb, and inside of here is honeybee larva. This is, I would say, 7 days old because it hasn't been capped yet. And this is the developing brood. The way that we think of a healthy larva to look is we want it to be in a C shape, laying on her side, his or her side. It could be drone or it could be worker bee. So we're looking at this frame, right, to your right, and you can see they are laying perfectly on the bottom of the cell, and they're a nice C shape. They're not twisted or turned. They look very healthy, and that is exactly what we want. The healthy bee pupae. Now, you cannot see this from looking at the frame, but if you were to cross cut inside, you would be able to see this. So this is harder because you don't know what it looks like because it's been capped with a cell. But this is the image of what a healthy pupa would look like. There's no mites covering these bees. They look very healthy, and yeah, they're forming quite well. You can see their eyes start to emerge, and the eyes is actually the very last thing that will develop. And that's why the worker bee in the middle, this pupa does not have the eyes yet, because it's the very last thing. Now, I talked about what a healthy brood looks like because there's a terrible mite here in the United States, and it's actually found all over the US, or sorry, all over the world with the exception of Australia. And its scientific name is the Varroa destructor. How scary. That's its scientific name. I think it's so cool because it just sounds like a villain, the Varroa destructor.
That looks like a new good title for a science fiction book.
Absolutely.
The
Like-
first thing I thought was furry hamburger.
It does look like a hamburger patty, but I assure you, it is not as good as a hamburger patty sounds. We can think of it the same way. So this Varroa mite is actually attached to a honeybee in this image, and it's super microscopic. That's why it's zoomed in. You can see the bee hairs. But we could think of it as the same way as if there was a tick that was attached to our side, but instead of it being little, imagine that this tick is the size of a volleyball. How scary is that? Like, it's huge and it's attached to your side. That is the same proportions that a varroa mite is to a worker bee. So very large in comparison to the size, but the size isn't what makes it so bad. It transmits a lot of really nasty diseases, and that is what is really, really hard on the bees. So just to give you a brief cycle of the varroa mite, in this first cell, well, let me back up. Here's the egg. It's very tiny, smaller than a grain of rice, and this is the honeybee egg. This is the varroa's mites have not entered inside of this cell. Now, once the larva has formed, while it has not been capped, you will see that a female is entering inside of this cell, and it looks like another one has already ventured in before. Then the worker bee, the nurse bee, will come by and cap this frame, and then you can see over the course of the larva forming into the pupa that this mite is just laying eggs and breeding inside. So and then at the very end here, whenever the worker bee has fully developed, sorry about that, whenever the worker bee is fully developed, she'll then emerge out of the cell, and these mites have quadrupled. There were 2, and now it looks like there's 8, including these small ones. All right, so we saw the life cycle of the varroa, but here's the varroa hosting during different stages on the drone. So you can see here's the female. Awesome, someone circled that for me. The red ones are the females, and then these smaller, the white ones, are actually the males. And it's interesting because the female that entered the hive or entered the cell here during step 1, this is actually the mother. So the mother mite will actually mate with her sons to produce more. And this is a worker bee that has been infected with the deformed wing virus, which is transmitted by the varroa mite. So that's why varroa is so bad, is not that it's feasting on the bee itself, is that during the process, it's transmitting really nasty diseases like the deformed wing virus, which if you're looking at this worker bee, you can see that her wings are shriveled up and she's never going to be able to fly. Therefore, she'll never make it outside of the hive to forage for pollen and nectar. So let me, okay. Okay. So varroa monitoring, there's a couple methods that we can use. We can do this grid pattern on the bottom of the bottom board. Tongue twister. And the idea is that you don't want any more than 50 mites per day. That's the threshold. This isn't my favorite way to monitor and check for varroa mites. I actually prefer to do a sugar wash or an alcohol wash right here, in which you take a third a cup of bees and you actually put in powdered sugar and you shake them up in this mason jar. And then while you're shaking them, the bees are completely fine this way, but the powdered sugar will force the worker bees to clean themselves off, and it actually knocks off the varroa mites that are attached on the worker bee. So then you're able to open up this can and dump the cup of powdered sugared worker bees onto a plate. Then the worker bees will fly off, and what's left on your plate is the varroa mites. And so you can do a quick spray of water, and then you're able to count how many varroa mites were inside that can of 100 bees. And so what we find is if there's more than 2 to 3 mites, that's a really good indicator for the beekeeper to go ahead and start treating for varroa. Now, a couple controls. I'll explain them in 2 different sets. So there's hard chemical controls that we use to control varroa, such as Apistan, Checkmate, Apivar. But the important thing is, when I mean hard, it's not like the actual state. It's just a harder treatment on the bee. So we don't like to apply taxing or hard chemicals back to back. So we like to alternate a hard chemical with a soft chemical. And some of the soft chemicals are Apiguard, Mitaway, oleic acid. And so those are just different ideas. Maura, do you have a question?
Yes, I'm actually her sister. I was also listening in. I
Oh.
was wondering how many times, like a week, a month, or a year, should we do the sugar wash?
So the sugar wash, that is a really great question, because a lot of beekeepers think that it's important to do the sugar wash after you've treated for varroa. So after you've either applied these hard chemicals or the soft chemicals. But if you're applying after you think you have a hive problem, or you only apply before to figure out if you have a varroa problem, then you don't know if your treatments were effective. So there's the University of Florida publishes beekeeping calendars on our social media page. And so typically during the winter months, you don't really have to check for varroa, but as soon as March rolls around, late February, you need to be doing sugar treatments or alcohol washing to check and get a mite count. Now, if it's over 2 to 3 mites, then you need to apply. And another important thing is, if you have, let's say, 3 beehives, and the first beehive only had 1 mite, but the second beehive next to it had 14 mites, do I only treat the hive that had 14 mites
I think
and
you should.
don't treat the mite or the hive with 1? No, you have to treat all of the hives with the same product during the same time frame in your apiary. So all of them have to be treated, because if you didn't, you would build up a pesticide resistance. So really great question. To answer that, definitely during the spring and the summer and late in the fall. So I would say about 3 times a year, it's really important. But also, if you're treating, you need to check and get numbers before your treatment and after your treatment, because you might find that these treatments may not work for your colony. This is not foolproof. Some of these mite populations are building resistance. It was actually about 5 years ago, we were having a huge problem as an industry, because most of the beehives here in the US had built up a resistance to Apistan, not the bees itself, but the mites. So they were applying Apistan, which is hard on bees, to find that it didn't kill the varroa population. So then we had to start finding new products like Checkmate and Apivar with all these different primary chemicals that would allow for the mites to die. And it's really tricky, because when you think about it, right, you have a varroa mite that's attached to a bee, and it's an insect attached to another insect, but you're trying to kill one insect without killing the other insect. So it's a lot of work in the lab and in the field to figure out what works and what doesn't work. A couple of more cultural and mechanical controls that you could use is drone removal, and you can see that in the image to the right. And then screen bottom boards. I talked about the importance of that earlier when we were discussing the hive components. And then hygienic queens. Yep, queen right there in the center. So we can actually buy these queens. There's breeding programs from the USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture, has put millions of dollars into breeding programs that allows for queens to be selected who have greater behavioral tolerances and more hygienic, which means they clean themselves more often. And as they clean themselves, they're knocking off the drone, or sorry, they're knocking off the varroa mite, and then the varroa mite can fall through the cracks within the screen bottom board. And the idea behind the drone removal, it might sound a bit odd, but the varroa mites really like to reproduce on drones. They have more hemolymph for fatty tissue because, like we said, they're a little bit bigger than the workers. And so in this image, the beekeeper is actually removing some of the drones so that they're reducing the attractiveness of the hive to varroa. Now, a couple other nasty pests within the hive is wax moths, and you can see the damage. Now, if you go into your attic or into your storage shed, you'll find some dusty looking moths, and that's what we call wax moths. There's greater wax moths and lesser wax moths, and that's actually their names, not as if one was better than the other. And so we have those all in the United States. And so the problem is that they'll actually burrow through the cells and they'll leave all of this nastiness inside the cells. And then it makes it not possible for the bees to lay inside. Typically, this isn't a huge problem because if you see a lot of wax moths inside of your hive, that means you already have a bigger problem. This is more of a secondary pest, meaning that it's not our first attention. If you have a lot of wax moths, that's going to let you know that you have bigger problems going on in your hive if it's susceptible to wax moths, because a healthy hive would keep out these wax moths. Here's a little bit more damage. This is like a really crazy case. You can see just all of the larvae, all of these eggs. Like, this hive has been abandoned for a very long time and there weren't bees in here for months. That's only the only explanation as to how bad this hive could be. A couple remedies that the beekeeper could do if they are storing honey supers. So this means that the only frames inside these contained honey. There was no brood. So bees aren't actually living in these hives. It was just the honeycomb that they built. If you store them stacked on top of each other in this form, like crisscross, kind of like Jenga, you're able to create airflow and circulation, which makes it less attractive. There's also crystals that you can put underneath here, and it just has a very strong smell and it kind of keeps the wax moths away. Okay, so small hive beetles. I mentioned this when talking about the pollen patties because a beekeeper can't put too large of an amount of pollen patties out or back to back. It's more of just a supplemental feeding, because if you have too much, the yeast within the pollen patties will actually replicate and will grow bacteria, and the small hive beetles really enjoy feasting on that. So here's an image. They look really big, but in comparison to the bee, it's very small. So this image to the left is the beetle larva eating bee brood, and this is a very crazy case. You can see there's so many of the larvae in this image, and they're sliming out the cells, and this slime is not attractive to the bees. They are not going to want to lay. Again, like the wax moth, the small hive beetle is a secondary pest, meaning that if you have an image this bad of small hive beetles, you have other problems like varroa, like something that is much more significant, because a healthy bee colony, again, would defend and chase off the beetles. Here's some other images. So to the left, you see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm counting 6, 7, 8. Wow, there's a lot on this frame of small hive beetles, and they just annoy the worker bee, and you'll find worker bees chasing them around the hive. there's traps that I can put in my hive as a beekeeper, and what the honeybee does is she can chase this beetle into the trap, and the beetle falls in. Sometimes the trap may contain vegetable oil, and it'll become submerged in the vegetable oil and it dies. So that's one of the ways that I can help my hive defend itself against small hive beetles. Some other things that you can do aside from the traps you can place in your hive is using checkmite. You could use nematodes. Does anyone know what nematodes are? So nematodes are basically microscopic worms that live inside of the soil, and it's very important. Oh, Tilly, I'm so sorry, I didn't see your hand raised. Do you want to answer that?
Where are the common pests most commonly found in the United States?
All over. Typically in the winter in hives up north, you're not going to find a lot of the small hive beetles or the wax moths. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on the strength of the colony. If you have a very strong colony, they're not going to have a lot of these pests. But if you have a weaker colony that's maybe been abandoned as well, you're going to find a lot of small hive beetles, ants. I didn't mention ants, but they are attracted to beehives and the wax moths. So good
Kind of like how most likely lions are to pounce on the baby elephants than the big elephants.
Yep. Yeah, same idea. Yeah, they're going to attack the weaker hives first because they don't really stand a chance against a strong hive. But the nematodes, if we're having a problem with small hive beetles specifically, these nematodes, which are microscopic worms that live in the soil, if we place, you can actually buy nematodes. If you place nematodes in the soil surrounding your hive, the small hive beetle reproduction system, a reproductive pattern, is to forage to mate with inside of the honeybee hive, but it has to lay its eggs in the dirt, in the soil. So if we place nematodes, these nematodes are actually going to feast on these small hive beetle larvae and eggs that are inside the soil. So that's one way that we can break their cycle. That I think is pretty cool. Biological control is what it's known as. Another problem that is inside of the hive, it's a spore-forming bacteria. This is a bacterial infection, and it's called American foul brood. It's really hard on the bees, and it can live inside of the cells, the spores of this bacteria can live for 10 years. So the only thing that can be done when you have American foul brood is completely burn the hive, and it's very sad. I've never been infected with this disease. My hives haven't, but I know beekeepers who have, and you have to burn your entire colony because it will continue to live inside of the wax years after and inside of your beekeeping equipment. That's why I said at the beginning that it's really important that we clean our hive tools as we go in between hives. And then I saw your hand raised, Maura, if you wanted to ask that question.
Your question. Go. She was wondering what you said you put around the hive to prevent the beetles, something in the soil.
Oh yeah, it's called nematodes. It's
Okay.
this bottom left image. It's not a very good image. I feel like you could find videos that would explain it to you better on YouTube if you're interested. But nematodes are a totally different branch of entomology. We have entomology and nematology, entomology being insects and nematodes being these microscopic worm-like things. And as we're learning more about the soil and we're putting more emphasis on soil health and biome systems, we're finding that nematodes can either be really helpful or really hard when we talk about growing crops. So nematodes in this case can be beneficial because it's going to be eating the eggs and the larva that's inside of the soil laid by the small hive beetle. So that way we can stop their breeding. But that's just an example of one way that you could defend your hive against small hive beetles. Again, small hive beetles is not the biggest issue. It's a secondary pest. So remember that Varroa mites are the biggest problem worldwide facing bees, not pesticides, not small hive beetles, not wax moths, not American foul brood. It's Varroa mites because it transmits terrible diseases. Some signs, so back to the bacterial diseases. So now we're not talking about pests, we're talking about bacteria. The American foul brood, again, there's no cure. This is extremely rare that it happens, but it's really hard on the hives. Some signs of infections is the nasty ropiness of the cells. You can stick in like a piece of pine straw, and if you pull out, and the best word that I can think of is just gunk. If you pull out your straw or your pine straw needle and it clings to it and it looks like a rope, like in this image, it kind of looks like a rope that's being pulled, you'll know that it's American foul brood. This is a great image. See this twig, it looks like was stuck inside of the cell, and as it comes out, it has that attached rope, and that's how you know. Yeah, there's not a lot of means for a treatment. And then its cousin is the European foul brood, and it's very hard to remember the difference, but we can actually vaccinate hives against European foul brood, but American foul brood we cannot do anything for. And the final problem with hives and what beekeepers have to look out for is viruses. So we can treat for Varroa for viruses.
Like, is it as harsh as coronavirus?
Well, yes. I mean, in this case, when we're talking about the bees cannot get the coronavirus, but they do have a lot of viruses that you can't treat for. We don't have vaccinations. You know, hopefully we'll have a vaccination for COVID-19, but there's no vaccinations aside from European foul brood. So the best way that you can defend your hive against viruses, and this is more of a precautionary measure, is to treat for Varroa, because Varroa is what vectors, it's the vector for many different viruses. And sometimes it has to do with your queen and genetics. Some people are just more susceptible to getting certain viruses. In this case, with bees, you can introduce a new genetic line by requeening. And that is the end of this slideshow. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
Like, how many bees can get infected at once? Also, it's really scary thinking about that.
I know. So the entire hive can be infected. You may see it only appear in certain individuals, but it's going to decrease the strength of the hive and potentially kill the entire hive. So that's why it's important as beekeepers that we go in the hive and we check them regularly every 2 weeks to make sure, we're checking for mood, brood, and food, because that's good indicators of other problems that we're treating regularly for Varroa mites, and keeping our eye out for some of the other problems. So Maura, I see that you have do you have another question?
Yeah, like, how big are bees?
How big are bees?
Yeah.
So it depends on the bee that you're looking at, but typically a worker bee, if you stick out your pinky, the very top of your pinky finger is about how big a worker bee is. A drone, instead of being longer, they're just wider. And then a queen is going to be about double the size of that worker bee. So just look at your pinky. And then Maura, if I can get your question, and then I'll make sure to get everyone's.
Can
Go for it, Ellen.
I then go first?
Can I get that again? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
She was wondering if Ellen could go first because she's
Oh.
seen Ellen hand up for a while.
Oh, thank you. Ellen, you can go ahead.
How big can a beehive really be? A real beehive? Because I've never seen a real beehive.
So that question definitely has a lot of options because you can have a small beehive. Remember the nook that has 5 frames? You can have just a brood frame or a brood box that has 8 frames or 10 frames, and you can stack honey supers on top. So potentially a beehive that has a brood box and many honey supers could be the size, could be the height that you are. So it depends on how large, how much honey the beekeeper is trying to produce. Those are just a lot of factors.
That is big.
Yeah, yeah.
As big as us?
Yeah. Not as big as me, but probably as tall as you. It could be large.
That's weird.
7 feet tall.
So how do they make it? Out of honey or hard?
No, the beekeeper. So if we're talking about managed beehives, let me go back to it. Let me find an image. If we're talking about a managed bee colony, the beekeeper is providing the boxes. So the bees aren't building the boxes because that's made of wood. That's what I'm referring to. That could be the height of view. And
That's a real
look at
one.
this image. See how many wooden pieces there are, wooden boxes inside of here. On
How
the
do
frames, inside of the frames is what the bees would draw out honeycomb on. So
how do they make real ones?
so the real ones would not be, they would not grow to be tall. They would be growing inside of a tree trunk or a tree cavity. And they can be all different shapes. So that's a hard answer. I mean, it could be the entire inside of an oak tree trunk that's been hollowed out. It could be the entire side of a storage shed, that entire wall. The bees could have like a single sheet of honeycomb. So, I mean, it can be very large or it could be very small.
So my mom said that she really wanted me to do this because my grandma is a beekeeper.
Yes, I think you
And she
told me that.
wanted me to help.
Yeah, you should help. That would be awesome. I get my sister to help me all the time in my
'Cause
beehive.
I want to hold a bee. I want to hold Ellen, which is probably big.
Yeah, for sure. Mora,
I was wondering how big is the queen bee? I can't remember.
so the queen bee, let me go back, find an image. You can see that she's larger than all the other bees in the hive, but really her abdomen is what makes her long. If we go back to the very first image where you spotted a bee, if you look down to the bottom center, you can see the queen bee, she has a very long abdomen and the stripes aren't as pronounced as they are on the worker bee. So if you are looking at your thumb again, instead of being the top half of your thumb, go a little bit farther, maybe to the second skin indentation, I guess is the best word for it, on your pinky. And I think I might have said thumb. I'm so sorry. I'm talking about my pinky. And that's how you can, get a good idea of how long she is. And that's for a mated queen. A queen that has not went on her mating flight is much smaller than that. She actually is about the size of a worker bee. Are there any other questions? So I don't remember who asked this question. I wish I remember exactly who asked it, but last time, last presentation, someone wanted to see an image of a drone having its wings eaten off or bit off by a worker bee. So I did you one better. Instead of finding just a picture, I found a video on YouTube. So let me pull up that video really quick because it is pretty neat. It's kind of crazy that this happens inside of a hive, but still important. So let
Wait,
me,
why do they have to do that? That sounds so scary. How would
yeah,
you like it if all your hair was ripped out?
exactly. Let me share. How do I?
Sorry, I'm just horrified because I have really long hair.
What's going on? Are you okay?
Okay,
That's weird. It's just, oh.
here we go. Can everyone see it? Okay.
Epic battle. Top bee is a worker bee, female. A huge bee is a drone, which is male. Go girl. There's another one right there too. Man,
Can everyone see what's going on?
not day to be a
Why do they have to do that? I forgot.
eviction day in the beehive.
So we call it eviction day, and that
There's a big drone
is
on that
when
edge, right down here. Just trying to sneak
it's
back into the
becoming
hive.
winter and we don't have as much honey inside the hive. So the worker bees kick the drones out, but the drones don't willingly want to
He's already
leave.
been kicked out a few times.
So they keep coming back. The drones do. And eventually the worker bees will chew off the drone's legs and its wings because then it will never be able to enter back in the
Come on,
hive
girls, just
if
a
it
little
can't
honey.
fly.
Or
So-
worse, it will die.
And they'll die, exactly. Oh
Yeah,
no.
exactly what the girl who antonated said.
See,
Oh no!
see it right here? There's two.
Me, that was me.
They're kicking
Oh,
the drones
Tilly,
out.
sorry.
Look,
I'm
they're
gonna be
both of them are chewing the wings
So
off.
worker lady's trying to kick the drone out. Out with you.
And then he leaves.
The drones are just so much.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
Yeah, crazy. But I mean, it makes sense because the drones don't really do a lot in the hive. And so because of that,
All
they
the
don't
things.
add any work during the winter months and there's less food and the hive doesn't have enough resources to feed them because they don't contribute during those winter months. Did you have your hand up, Ellen?
It was very glitchy, so I couldn't see it very well.
What is it?
It was very glitchy because I can see it very well.
Yeah, the video quality for that video wasn't very good because it's really hard. It's really
It's
hard
very
to capture those images because it doesn't happen very often. So yeah, I'm sorry, not a great video quality, but you can kind of get the general idea of, you know, the worker chewing the drones off and how they keep coming back and back, but they can't because the girls put their foot down, so to say, and they are kicking them out. So yeah. Are there any final questions?
like
Well, I guess girl power?
Girl power.
Question
Yeah.
mark?
Yeah, maybe not, maybe so.
In the beehive, the boys are a bunch.
Like, all the boys' legs are getting teared off. I mean,
So now who's evil and devious?
Yeah, it's
Florida has a question.
and
Yep.
it'd be
Victoria. Did you have a question?
I have a
What kind of bees can drill holes in wood?
Oh, that's great. Those are carpenter bees. That is not related to honeybees. That's a different species. So carpenter bees, they do drill holes in wood, and that's what they're solitary bees. So a honeybee hive, there's thousands of bees with the queen, the workers, the drones. But a carpenter bee, there's male and female. The female will mate with the male, and then she'll dig a hole in the side of the house, could be in a tree, could be like a pole barn, like a wooden board in a fence post maybe, and she's going to lay her eggs and keep food. And then she's a solitary bee, meaning that she lives by herself. Drones, or the worker, sorry, the males as well, but um, the females is really who's restoring the future. Ellen?
I thought of something. What are drones, queens?
So drones, so they still have the same queen. The queen to a drone is its mother, just like the worker bees in the hive. The queen to them is their mother as well.
But
Uh-huh. Did someone else have a question? So whenever, I think it was maybe last week, or not last week, last month, when we started talking about drones and the queen, whenever a worker, or sorry, whenever the queen mates with the drone, that is not her son, because she's mating with drones from another hive from somewhere else. So she goes on a mating flight and she mates with drones from other hives, not her own hive, because they would share DNA. And the idea behind mating with many different drones is that you have a greater chance of survival because you have a greater genetic variety within the genes.
and like why do they why don't the other guys that mate with them, not worker bees, the drones, why don't the drones think of the girl they mate with, the queen they mate with, their wife?
So when the drone mates with the queen on the one mating flight, she only mates once in her life. The drone immediately dies after,
Well, how?
because they're trying to think. Because whenever they mate with the queen, that forces them to lose important internal organs within inside of their body, so they're unable to survive after.
But why? It's not like they're shooting out their stingers like a worker bee, are they?
No, they don't have, remember, drones don't have stingers.
I know, but like, how?
But a worker bee also dies whenever she stings, because same idea. So whenever,
Like how the drones like die when they just mated with someone. That's it.
So Lexi, like Lauren has said in a couple of different of these presentations, the only reason a drone is around is for the mating flight. So when his job is done, it is a fact of his biology to be done with his time in the hive and being a bee. So that is just essentially how nature has made it so that he can't then go back and take more resources out of the hive.
yeah, that's a great way to, great way to put it. Yeah.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah. Just how nature works.
Mm-hmm.
And then Tilly, you can have our last question of the night.
So how many times is like the average time for pests? Like how many times a year is average?
Well, there's pests living inside of the hive year round. It's just the threshold or the amount is what will cue the beekeeper to treat. For varroa mites, it depends on the amount of brood. So when there's a lot of brood in the hive, there's a lot of varromites. If there's not a lot of brood in the hive, there's not a lot of varromites. So beekeepers like to treat when there's a spike in brood population. For the small hive beetles, for wax moths, I leave beetle traps inside my hive year round just to make sure. In the winter, they're not breeding, so there's not a strong population. So there's the least amount of pests within the hive during the winter months, but the rest of the year, especially, in Florida, we have a lot of insects and bugs. I know not everyone is tuning in from Florida, but if you're in a southeastern United States and it's kind of hot, you have probably pest problems year round.
Billy's kitty corner to me.
Yep, yeah. So that is a great question, but it really depends on the hive itself. It's not good to generalize things. It's good as the beekeeper to know yourself if what your hive needs specifically so that you can address your own hive's needs and the rest of your apiary. So great question. I've really enjoyed all of your questions. You are so bright, so intelligent. And I want to ask you all a question really quick. And that is, do you think that you would ever want to become a beekeeper or to get a hive in the future? It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, but would you ever be interested in getting a beehive? And if so, give me a thumbs up or raise your hand. Thumbs up and 2 hands raised. Yes. Tilly's saying, I don't know, maybe. It's a lot of work, but it
I
is
don't
so
even want to raise drones so they wouldn't sting me.
only drones. Yes, I wish that was possible. But yeah, awesome. Well, I really enjoyed getting to speak with you, and I'm very sad this is our last time, but I am sure that you're going to continue changing the world and keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep your curiosity because it is inspiring. So thank you so much. And with that, I will leave it with your leader. So thank you, girls.